Okay, folks, hello! Hello. This is wonderful for me because this is the first fam tour that I'm giving in 4 years since the pandemic. This neighborhood has experienced so much change, and actually I've been walking these streets for over 80 years, okay? Came down here with my mom when we were very young in the 1940s. I was a kid. But my roots go back here because my mother and family came to this neighborhood in 1912 from Moravia, Central Europe, which is part of the Czech Republic today. Many different nationalities lived down here. And this wonderful book will tell you all about it. And I marked 2 places where you saw the Sahadi store. Well, those were Russian people standing in front of it. There were Ukrainians and Poles, and my family from Moravia were here also too. But this neighborhood, to go back in time ethnically, this was one of the first Irish and German settlements. But by the time you had Castle Clinton immigration depot from the 1850s till Ellis Island, all they had to do was walk up the street over here, okay? Even in 1914, there were more Irish living down here than there were Syrians. And by the 1914 survey, almost half the neighborhood was Slavic, but nobody knows that. You can all study the history of St. Peter's, which is the first Roman Catholic parish in New York State, never mind New York City. So everything comes out of this parish and this church, and this is not the original. There was one here already about 1785, I believe, right after the American Revolution, and the chapel was dedicated to the Infant of Prague. In the 1890s, it was where the Melkites, which was a Syrian Catholic in union with Rome, where they would worship before they could build their church in the 1920s. But they were worshiping in the basement of this church in the 1890s. Talk about multiculturalism, okay? Show and tell, you'll see the old St. Peter's, and next to it, you have an old Federal-style row house type building that was the rectory of St. Peter's. And in that courtyard, there was an educational facility and a Catholic library there. That building was sold off by the Catholic Church to build that big skyscraper next to it, okay? So they could go higher. Now you have to go inside St. Peter's at some point, and you can see the wonderful crucifixion over the altar that was donated by the Archbishop of Mexico. The first congregations were Spanish and French, okay? Now you can look in this photo, it's very interesting, and look way down, and you see on Church Street was the 6th Avenue L, okay? And on the next block over, which is not there anymore, on Greenwich Street, was the 9th Avenue L. Well, I remember that street, what it looked like. And that street, where that new skyscraper was built, there were several shops in Barclay Street. And the several shops were religious goods shops, where you could buy the vestments, you know, for the church and the liturgy and the chalices, and all the religious statues and rosaries and so on. There were a lot of different certain special places of streets that catered to certain types of businesses. And that was the place where you came in New York to buy religious goods on Barclay Street, okay? The old St. Peter's, it was 1785, and the new St. Peter's is 1836.
Yeah, it's 1836 when they clear it.
Yeah, okay, that's the new St. Peter's.
And it doubled the width. So
Yeah.
the original one was half the size. I think the Spanish ambassador laid the cornerstone for the original church. But ironically, the parish is actually founded by the Portuguese ambassador.
Fantastic. The history that we don't know should show us all what we should do about today's world in integrating everybody together. We're all part of this great story, right? Well, I remember walking through all these streets because my first job downtown was in 1956, 1957 as a messenger for an engraver. And I used to bring his dies that he used to have printed places all over where the South Street Seaport is and was, and all over the west side over here. So I walked through the World Trade Center area before it was ever thought of as a World Trade Center, okay? The Washington Market that I mentioned was on the site of where the One World Trade Center is today. That would be changed when Hunts Point gets started. The markets moved up there. That's where we used to go to get our rationing for butter. At the time of the Second World War, we had ration coupons. And anybody online with a coupon and $1, my father was about making $1 an hour. But if you needed it, if you were like my mother and my aunts and grandmother, they baked a lot. So here's this little 3 or 4-year-old with my mom, very smart lady, giving me $1 and a coupon. And we get up to the line after waiting outside for I don't know how long. And I'm standing there, tippy-toe, handing up to the guy saying, "A pound of butter, mister, please," on my tiptoes. And as a person, I was entitled to get another pound of butter.
Oh.
And my father was working. He couldn't stand on line like we could, you know? So that's what I remember coming down here. Before the Twin Towers, there were 2 other sets of Twin Towers in downtown New York. They go back early to the 1900s. And the 2 greatest ones were the Hudson Terminal buildings. And they would have been the next block over. They would have started over here on Fulton Street, gone to Dye Street, and then to Portland Street, okay? They were 22-story high buildings, what we call the Hudson Tubes, which was the old name for the Port Authority. If you want to still see that indication, go to the Cortlandt Street station of the R train, and you'll still see in the early 1900s style where it says Hudson Tube. I kind of roughly estimate that in my lifetime of walking these streets, I had seen about 1/4 to 1/3 of Lower Manhattan disappear. All the streets that were closed because of the World Trade Center, about 13 blocks of streets, the widening of Water Street, the police precinct plaza, the building of the South Bridge Towers, everything down in that area on the east side too, was a lot of change. Now we're going downhill, right? The shoreline, the original shoreline is Greenwich Street. Greenwich Street, which was right here where we crossed. Okay, you have a good loud voice, right? I want you to read these 3 paragraphs.
Sure. Radio was a novelty. Most people were intimidated by it. You know, the idea of information coming through the air, through the ether, was something that was one step away from black magic. Within a few years, people regarded it as the greatest thing since flushed toilets. That was Bill Schneck, son of Harry L. Schneck, who started the first radio store on Portland Street in 1921.
Here's Portland Street here. Okay.
Cool. This was the most unique street. I played classical music, some of the others played jazz, some of the others played different. It was a conglomeration you heard as you walked along the street. It was really an experience. And that's a gentleman named Irving Simon, Remembering Radio Row. And finally, Channel 2 News archival news report from the 60s. When the Port of New York Authority first announced the proposed construction of the World Trade Center, the brochure quoted from Walt Whitman, "High growth of iron, splendidly uprising toward clear skies." To the Port Authority, the construction of the World Trade Center might have meant growth. But to many of the 300 small businessmen in the 13 blocks to be cleared for the center, it meant disaster.
Another whole story of what I remember, this whole area having streets all the way across, like Cortlandt Street and Dye Street, ran all the way to where West Street is and where all the docks were. By the 1970s, the World Trade Center towers would be erected. Quite a change. And then, of course, now the rebuilding after 9/11 was another big change that happened in our lifetimes. But I'm going back a lifetime before most of you folks here. Up on Warren Street and Murray Street was still a couple of the old places where you could buy light fixtures or anything else. Now on Canal Street, you'll still see some of those sort of junk shop remnants of electronics and things. Well, that's how it all grew. So it was quite something for me to see all of what that Radio Row was disappear. And that book was written by Barbara and Marty Rizek, Barbara was Ukrainian, Marty was Slovak, and Joanne Medvecki was Rusin. Okay, so now, who are the Rusins, right? They were another minority of Slavic people that never had a country. They're in Eastern Slovakia, a lot of them today. But this was their neighborhood, one of the unknown minorities again. And interesting, too, in Esther's building lives a gentleman upstairs on the top floor, right? Named Eddie Metropolis. Greek name.
Wow.
His mother was Rusin, and she worked for Sahadis. Talk about integration, okay? Very happy that I can do this. This is a blessing to me, and all my blessings, okay? And all my extended family, right? But you can still see remnants of the old neighborhood. You look back and you see the sort of red brick, low-rise building. That's mid-1800s, maybe after the Civil War period or such like that, when this was basically an Irish and a German immigrant neighborhood, whereas the people from the Middle East didn't come until around 1880. There's a wonderful book called Strangers in the West by Linda Jacobs. She documented everybody to the Syrian community, that they were the ones that gave a special identity to the neighborhood. But the real thing is they were all integrated already with the Irish and the Germans, and then afterwards with all the Slavic people that lived here. And you'll see a couple of the old skyscrapers, you know, the 20, 15-story buildings behind the low-rise over there. Two of our actual friends of the Lower West Side members lived in one of those buildings on Cedar Street, and that would have gone all the way across again.
Can you tell us why some of these big groups left?
Well, economics, persecution of religion. Or my mother's two cousins came to escape going in the Austrian army in the First World War. And the same with a lot of the Syrians now were Christian, and they were not being allowed into the Muslim armies of the Ottoman Empire, but then they were, so a lot of them were leaving so they didn't have to serve also in the army then. This is Greenwich Street. You're going to see a sign over here that says bar, and that bar was Slezak's, and this is the interior of Slezak's in the 1960s. In the 1940s, there was the eminent domain out to build a battery tunnel. So they moved uptown several blocks like a lot of other people did. Well, by the 1960s, they were one of those 300 businesses that were eminent domained out. So it's interesting to think about these people and their lives, how they were disrupted by these two acts of eminent domain. Forced out without really much compensation. And a lot of the immigrant people were so used to authority. But there was a king, you know, so a lot of these people in their DNA didn't have what we do now today to know all these freedoms, which we're trying to protect. Okay. Anyway, onward. Looking up the block here on Cedar Street, you see these wonderful dormer window federal row houses of the early 1800s. This was what was here walking up Greenwich Street, okay? There were lots of townhouses in all these streets that were turned then into businesses on the first floor, rooming houses above. Here are a couple more of those townhouses. They were right on the street here between the new modern buildings on Thames Street. I used to walk down here in the 1950s until the 1980s when I stopped working in the financial district and then would be working in my old Sunset Park neighborhood before I got into tour guiding in the 1990s. Anyway, so you see these two buildings here. Those were the other two twin towers, 111 and 115 Broadway, to the north of Trinity Churchyard. I worked in 111, and we had a view of the churchyard in one of the brokerage houses where I worked. So those two buildings were designed by a Francis Kimball, who built these twin towers of 20 some stories, over 300 feet high, around 1906, 1907. So this was the early skyscraper development, and those two are still there. Okay, now that's Thames Street. Around the corner on Thames Street, there was St. Peter's. My mother went to St. Peter's School, which is the building right on the corner here of Thames and Trinity Place, right behind Trinity Church Cemetery, okay? And they would put on various public events. And here is one of a play going on, put on by the downtown Slovak school. And this little guy here with the fiddle was Marty Rezek, one of the authors of that book in 1941. This is Albany Street. Albany Street was a little extra wider street, and Marty told me this is where they used to play their stickball games on Sunday. Because remember, in the 1940s, nobody really had a car. And there was a Syrian candy shop here, too, where they would all go in for a drink or for refreshments and so on. So you see what this neighborhood was? It was a thriving, vibrant community of different ethnicities, and all that history is gone and forgotten, and we're trying to save the other two remaining buildings that can tell that story. So now, the important new St. Nicholas's that we pass, designed by Calatrava, it's quite an architectural statement. It's a beautiful building, but it starts out as a very modest little church. The little church that was in the shadow of the South Tower of the World Trade Center that fell right on top of it. You can see the interior of the church, which was an original early 1800s townhouse that had then become a saloon or a bar in the early 1900s. And then by the 1910s, this is one of the first Greek Orthodox churches in New York City. So it's a very proud representation for the Greek community to be memorialized here. Cedar Street, where you see the white modern building, right around the corner from that is where St. Nicholas would have been. And next to it is where St. Joseph's, which was down where the Battery Garage is, when they were eminent domain out in the 1940s, they moved up to the corner of Cedar and West Street, right next to the Greek Orthodox Church. But since there wasn't a congregation here much anymore, they sold out and that building was torn down. Now, you know about transportation. The L trains come down in the 1930s by 1940. But in 1909 to 1915, they were building what we call the 4th Avenue Local. Who the hell knows where the R train goes? But if you said 4th Avenue Local, you knew it ran under 4th Avenue in Brooklyn. Well, they were doing the excavation. My aunt used to go down into the excavations, and wherever she could find a piece of wood that she could carry, she took it out. They were very poor. They had a wood-burning stove in their tenement on Washington Street in the kitchen. So they needed wood. Okay, now, you can see the wonderful, about 1907, 1908, Cass Gilbert tall skyscraper, all terracotta. It was one of the forerunners of one of the great skyscrapers, and it was renovated for about $130 million after the World Trade Center damage. But it was built so well that it did withstand all the debris and everything falling, and now it's residential. But now, on the site, you can see also these smaller little red brick warehouses and stuff. Well, I've got a better picture on the other side of what those warehouses looked like, They were all where all the produce and things were being offloaded from the ships and such. Remember, the Washington Market was right up here, so they had all the deliveries and goods and things coming right to the waterfront just 2 blocks away. And you can see that still, those smaller buildings. Now, I remember the heyday of all of this traffic and push carts and things that were down on these streets And it was chaos with all these market things all down here in the area by the waterfront. But I also want to point out the school building where the World Financial Center Hotel was PS 29. And this is where all the multi-ethnicities went to the public school over here. Okay, and this was torn down around 1960. Okay, now, you can see right around the corner, that's the American Stock Exchange from 1930. They saved that as a landmark. That was called the curb market because originally the stocks that couldn't be listed on the New York Stock Exchange were all traded by people yelling up from the curb to the offices of the brokerage house. So it was called the curb market. Okay. Anyway, onwards. 3 buildings side by side of these intense tenement, social civic buildings that lined all these streets before they were all torn down, okay? This is amazing that these 3 buildings survived. With the eminent domain action of the 1940s, where the Battery Garage is, all the way down to, Battery Park, and then just 3 blocks north here was all the eminent domain action of building the World Trade Center and destroying all the businesses and livelihoods and living conditions where the World Trade Center is today. Now, humanity, and low-rise buildings give you a nicer sense of a street pattern than you look at all these monster boxes all around which block out all the light and air. Architecture, we are products of our environment. So being where there are comfortable spaces and light and air, makes it a little bit better. If you wanted to be on Washington Street, not on Greenwich or Trinity Place, which had the L trains running overhead. This did not have the L train here, and it didn't have all the congestion of the waterfront, which was just the next block over on West Street, where all those ships were loading and unloading and whatever. But it was still a teeming, very busy neighborhood. You can see that corner of these low-rise buildings, which is where they're building the new skyscraper, next to the tenements on 109. My mother lived here. Anyway, my family, I'll introduce you to them. This was a picture taken about 1 year after they're in America. They were wearing all their folk embroidery costumes and handmade goods. Well, now they're all wearing the civics clothes. My grandmother has a shirt waist. My mother and my aunt have the little white bows in their hair. And my aunt, Betty, she's a Gibson girl with a fancy dress and all. These were their one good set of clothes. And nobody in those days smiled on pictures. It was very formal that you were serious about having a picture taken. This cost a lot of money to do this, to send back to the old country to let them know that we're okay, My mother and family were a family of 6 people. These were maybe 400 square foot apartments, railroad rooms. The only windows were in the front or the back at the end of the 3 rooms. Well, the 6 of them lived in the first room, which was a kitchen living room, slept on mats that they put down on the floor in the kitchen, and the little room was the bedroom for the parents, and the room with the windows in the back they rented to boarders to make extra money to pay the rent. So there were 8 people living in this 400 square foot apartment, which would make a nice studio or something now. Okay, I want to talk about the architecture. The 3 buildings you see behind you are done in 3 different styles, and they're all appropriate to what their functions are, okay? The first and the most dramatic is the former St. George Melkite Catholic Church. The Syrians were mostly Melkites. The Lebanese from the Mount Lebanon area of Syria were Maronite Christians. They worshiped using the language of Christ Aramaic in parts of their liturgy. They had a church down the block where the Battery Garage is. Okay, that was where their church was. in the early 1900s, and then they would be eminent domain out. But by the late 30s, they already bought the former Congregational Church in Brooklyn Heights, and that would become the Cathedral of Our Lady of Lebanon, where they have the original cornerstone from the Maronite Church down here in the lobby that they found when they were excavating the World Trade Center site. So the Melkites worshipped here, but originally they started out in the basement of St. Peter's where we were. But you can see the wonderful terracotta, and there's St. George slaying the dragon over the entrance. Okay, this was a wonderful building saved about 30-some years ago by a lovely couple that made it Moran's Bar and Restaurant, okay? This was originally a townhouse before it became a German dance hall and a rooming house. And it was given by a Syrian businessman to the Melkite community, and by 1929 they had a Syrian architect named Harvey Kassab design this wonderful terracotta facade on this narrow townhouse lot. The townhouses would be built here because this was the area where all the wealthy people of New York wanted to live.
So I just want to say, once upon a time, this neighborhood was the wealthy neighborhood. Carolyn Astor, whose original name was Carolyn Schermerhorn, if you watch The Gilded Age, she was born at the end of Greenwich Street in a townhouse. So this was her original neighborhood before all the wealthy people started moving uptown.
Yeah, why did the wealthy people move uptown? Because of cholera, influenza, and such. And also, you had now had the biggest ships now starting to dock on the Hudson River. And this became very nitty-gritty by the 1820s and 30s, and people were moving up towards Greenwich Village and north. But this was originally the very wealthy part of Manhattan. So that took us, 9 years to get that building landmarked in 2009. Landmark said this is not enough to make a landmark district, and each individual building was not meritorious enough except for the beautiful terracotta church, and that represents the Syrian community, but they neglected to give the history and reference to all these other multi-ethnic groups that had lived here, the Irish and Germans first, then the other various ethnic groups from the Middle East, and then all the Slavic groups that came later. So all that story of integration is told in the Downtown Community House. The Downtown Community House was given by the wealth of Wall Street, Mr. Childs, who was the Bon Ami big magnate, who, you know, a lot of these cleaning ladies use Bon Ami, I'm sure, who lived in the neighborhood. He donated almost $250,000 to build this beautiful neo-federal style building, opened in 1926. And I think it would be wonderful for the 100th anniversary of the building to be landmarked, because it has about 90% of its original facade with its mansard roof and tiling, but it was used for many things after the community house movement basically stops in the 1930s and stuff. It becomes a school, a maritime union, and its latest use was a Buddhist temple. Before it was abandoned for about 20-some years, and now just in the last year or so, it's become a very good social service for the homeless people going into housing. So it's been in service to community in various ways. In 1926, they had 15 nationalities represented at the opening of this building. There was a big to-do, and some of them were there in their national costumes. So it's representing a good multi-ethnic history of the neighborhood. It was designed by a John Jackson, who did dozens of YMCAs around the country, including a landmark YMCA up on 135th Street in Harlem. So it has a pedigree architect. Anyway, of course, you have religions. You have social service. And what do you have next to it? Residential. Show me one other immigrant neighborhood that side by side has those three representations. Not across the street or around the corner, but contiguous. It makes a statement. The tenement has a very simple, classic facade. It's not one of these with a lot of frou-frou on it. It has a lot of nice banding, and you can't really tell that the windowsills and lintels look very, very crisp. People said they were brownstone, and even in write-ups they say they were brownstone. They're not, they are cast iron.
Wow.
Which means that they stayed in pretty good shape all these years. Show me another building that has federal swag cast iron lintels. Of course, they were probably made in a factory where they were used by other buildings, but what is still existent is still on that building. So not only culturally, it was built for an Irish developer, or it was actually, I think it was more of a reworking of an older building. It got the facade, which is that beautiful high-end brick on the facade, in 1885. It has its still original cornice up on the top, and it has some of the cast iron facade of the old businesses on the first floor, where there were Syrian businesses, although most of the people living in the building were mostly Slavic or Irish. So it's interesting to hear all of these stories of all these different groups, and here you have that microcosm of what was. Anybody want to give us help and write a letter to landmarks?
Sure.
We had several hundred postcards. We have every major preservation organization and people like from Andrew Dolcott on down representing that these buildings should be landmarked. And yet landmarks is not listening to us. But we
So wait, they're landmarking it only as a little Syria, but not
That's right.
recognizing all
That's
the
right.
other ethnicities
That's
that were
right.
here.
Watch out, better let people walk through it. Okay, if you can see where the brick changes, up where there used to be a dormer window, that Flemish bond, along and a short brick, it becomes just the long bricks for a few layers, okay? That's when they made the top floor into a full floor. Otherwise, it was a 3-story, elegant townhouse from 1799 with the Lawrence family.
Wow.
You heard of Lawrence, Long Island? Well, it's all part of the Lawrence family holdings. There were actually 2 more houses like that the owner actually did some things to change some of the brickwork and take out the original hand-blown glass windows that were there from 1799. But landmarks finally did recognize that this corner building should be landmarked. So where the garden was, that little extension, in my day I remember, that was one of the last of the lingerie shops that were down here. That's one of the many Syrian Lebanese businesses that used to be in the neighborhood. A lot of pastry shops here, and newspaper offices, and a lot of importers and exporters. You can see we're only a block behind Trinity Church, and the elevated train ran right by here. Now, these streets like Exchange Place and Edgar Street here, which is one of the smallest streets in New York, it was moved up here, but we're probably now where Edgar Street originally was. There was another 2 buildings south of the Dickey townhouse. It was a grander house than the one you saw on the corner because it was 4 bays, 4 windows across. There's a landmark. It was built in 1810 for the Dickey family, another wealthy merchant family, and at one point in the 1830s it was the home of the French consulate. Okay, now you see the back of it is rounded. It was evidently very indicative again of the style of the early Federal Republic to have a rounded room to the back of it. Okay? You see the red and the blue painted buildings, tenement style. What's left? They didn't sell out when they were building the new modern buildings. You can still see what the buildings used to be up and down all these streets. Now, can you read that little plaque on the bench?
In memory of our forefathers who had a dream, donated by the National Federation of Syrian Lebanese American Club on behalf of the Midwest Federation of American Syrian Lebanese Clubs.
Thank you, Eileen. Well, there are a number of benches that have these plaques, including one to Amin Rouhani. He was one of the great writers of the Syrian Lebanese Arabic Renaissance. By the 1920s, there were many artists and poets and writers living down here, that they had formed the Pen League, which was a writers' league, and they developed a renaissance for Arab American culture here, downtown New York. Well, the cultural exchange was so great, Amin Rouhani tried to represent tying the East and the West together. And this celebration is the 100th anniversary of the Book of Holly. Two young boys, immigrants, lived on Washington Street, and they exemplified what the struggle was of the Syrian people. Well, a lot of these poets and artists were now merging the tradition of the more poetic East with the more dramatic, dynamic presence of the West. And he was one of the great intellectuals that did that kind of work in his writings. He was very well known at his time. So a wonderful scholar, Todd Fine, developed a whole history of Rouhani. And the 100th anniversary of the book was published. So Todd founded the Washington Street Historical Society, which is the sister organization to the Friends of the Lower West Side. So we've added another 2 plaque benchmarks. One there to our great Syrian genealogist and historian, Marianne Haig Napoli, who was very instrumental in the study of the Syrian church being landmarked. Unfortunately, she passed away in 2020, so we have a bench dedicated to her. We were raising funds for that, and meanwhile, my colleagues Esther and Linda went and raised money and put a bench there for me too, which I sort of like, well, I'm not dead yet, but they're remembering me. I'm embarrassed kind of by it. And there will be, thanks to the Washington Street Historical Society, public artwork here in the park by an Arabic artist to do an artwork of various styles of all the Arabic writings and such as a memorial that this was the first Syrian colony in the United States. In the 1880s, by the 1890s, they were all establishing themselves in Brooklyn already with the South Ferry, okay? There were over 300 Syrian businesses mentioned in the Syrian Business Directory around 1908. They had also their own Masonic order as well, so they were very much integrated into American society. This was Washington Street in the Harper's Bazaar Weekly on the other side of where the Battery Garage is, and actually the Arabic linotype that was used down here to print the Arabic newspapers and books was then brought over to the Middle East. They didn't have that until it started down here. This was the center of Arab culture for the breakup of the Ottoman Empire and all the immigrants that came here in the 1880s and 90s. We're going to end with Castle Clinton with the Immigration Depot in Battery Park, where you buy the tickets to Statue of Liberty and Ellis Island, but it also then became the aquarium. So my mother remembers as a kid, you know, they were poor immigrants. Where could they go on a Sunday but to Battery Park and go to the aquarium? Otherwise, they were taken to Coney Island to go to the kitchen where my grandfather washed dishes because they were the little girls of the dishwashing. Here is a wonderful thing, I think, of the breakdown of all the different ethnic groups and also showing where they came from. And you can even see that the Irish well outnumbered the Syrians that were living here, and the Slavic people were almost twice as many by 1914. Where is their story being told? Outside of what we're doing with memorializing, so we're hoping landmarks will finally understand that there is a great story to tell in landmark 2 buildings. You see that one tenement over here, on where the bridge is over the entrance to the Battery Tunnel. Well, that's where that one last tenement, that was a picture taken by Bernice Abbott, you know, with the wash hanging out in the back of this neighborhood that was destroyed by 2 acts of eminent domain. And I think it's a moral issue, too, that the city wants to not save their history. It's an incredible, I think, sense of culture and identity of an immigrant neighborhood that was destroyed. They were pushed out of their neighborhood that they loved so much. They could walk to work. They worked in the restaurants and the business trades, elevator operators and cleaning people and so on. They worked in the buildings right over here. They had the Washington Market a few blocks up to get all their fresh produce and things. They had the Battery Park for air and light. I'll tell you one little story before we leave. My mother and my Aunt Elizabeth were very entrepreneurial. The United Fruit Company piers were right over here on West Street, right behind where the downtown athletic club is and such. And they used to go when they were unloading the fruit, the pineapples and bananas and coconuts and such, and there would be loose stuff dropping on the dock or in the water. They would take it home, wash it, have it for their own selves, and then sell what they could to the people on the streets. You know, how do you survive? Okay. Now, my parents were very proud to be Americans. They became citizens, okay, in the 1930s and 40s. But they would take me as a little kid to the Statue of Liberty every year, reminding me of my, you know, my heritage of democracy and freedom. Okay. Catherine is going to be reading one of the oral histories that were written for us. But it's also a very poignant way memorializing your family history and what it means to be an American.
My memories of times gone by generate from the words that came from the lips of my grandparents and parents. They spoke of all that was so precious to them in the hope that we would keep alive their unique experiences from the 19th century through the early 20th century. Immigrants from Mount Lebanon and Syria, predominantly Christians, came to the United States searching for a new life. As they embarked from Ellis Island, their eyes fell on Lower Manhattan, and they liked what they saw, and they settled right there by the water in sight of the Statue of Liberty. My grandfather, George K. Rossi, my grandmother, Sadie Shaker Rossi, my father, Charles Mahfouz, and my great-uncle, Kamel Mahfouz, were among those early immigrants. There on Washington Street, the descendants of the Phoenicians, the great merchants of the world, opened their first businesses on American soil. This all was located in the shadow of where the World Trade Center would later stand. From Washington to Greenwich, to Rector Streets to Maiden Lane, you could find the gift shops, awns, Parisian lingerie, the Arabic bakeries, and much more. Proud of their heritage and devoted to this country, they are a viable and visible force in medicine, government, law, in the arts, fashion, business, and have notably served in the military with distinction. They have assimilated and are part of the life force of this great country. Respectfully submitted, Barbara Mahfouz Junkola.
That is one of several oral histories that we have that were written by people who lived in the neighborhood. So you can tell the passion they had for this community and for their culture. And that story has to be told. So that's a good reminder of where we came from and what we should all be about.
We're going to see Joe's Bench, the plaque on the bench here in the park.
It's... Oh, yeah. Okay.
Joe SVEHLAK, storyteller, multiculturalist, tour guide, historian, preservationist, traveler, founder of the Friends of the Lower West Side. His indefatigable spirit inspires us all.
Thank you.
Wow, Joe.
Thank you, Esther and Linda, for doing this behind my back.
Thank you on behalf of Janet that have made this all possible.
Yeah, well, thank you for letting me share it. Maybe I'll do another one on the east side of what used to be there. Wow, it's fun for me. I didn't think I'd survive in all this hot weather and everything, right?